we'll make a start now. I know there's one or two people on this call, on this session, that aren't members of the Architecture Club. So welcome to them. We are, for those of you who don't know, we're a sort of club without a home, and it's really all about conviviality and ideas and debate around architecture. And tonight is an important night because we've been really trying hard to get engaged with the younger members of the club, and we've got a series of 3 talks coming up, which have been organised by essentially by Emily Watson, who's on the committee, but she's sort of delegated that to 3 people, one of whom is Ode Azzi, who is with us tonight, and we'll be introducing George in a minute. So this is the first of those 3 talks. I find it really interesting because I went to Beirut probably 10 or 12 years ago now, maybe it's a bit longer. I've been there a couple of times, and it was a city that absolutely sort of captured my imagination. It was a fascinating place. And obviously, you know, it's just been through another dreadful occurrence back in August. And it's going to have to reinvent and rebuild itself yet again. And it seems to be one of those cities that is in a constant state of renewal and so forth. And I think the interesting challenge, which I'm sure George is going to talk about, is how that's going to happen, and you know, and how the mistakes that have been made in the past can be avoided this time round, hopefully. So with that, I'll hand over. Oh, I just want to say thank you to Rowena as well for her work in organising this. I'll hand over to Ode, who will introduce Dr. George Arbid.
Thanks, Mike. So good evening, everyone. I'm very delightful to be here with you tonight for a very special lecture, being from Beirut myself. We're going to learn more about George Arbid and his truly inspiring work. Dr. George Arbid is an architect with successive teaching positions at the Académie Libanaise des Beaux-Arts, the American University of Beirut, and the Lebanese University. He received the architecture degree from Alba and Doctor of Design degree from Harvard University. As the co-founder and director of the Arab Center for Architecture, George Arbid is taking on an immense and very important project of archiving the representative materials of architectural imaginaries in the Arab world during the modern period. Please join me in welcoming George Arbid. George, you can go ahead. Take over.
Okay, thank you very much for this introduction. And I'm very happy to share the story of Beirut modernism with you. My presentation will have 3 sections, if you want. One is a generic presentation about modern architecture. The second part will be about our activities and the creation of the Arab Center for Architecture. And third is the post-blast activities. And I'm sure you're interested to know more about that. So I will, if you allow me, share my screen. That's it. Okay. Can you hear me well? Okay. Perfect. So I'd like to start with this magazine. I haven't used this for a long time now, but this is a magazine I discovered when I was doing my studies at the Harvard GSD. And it is a cover of a magazine published in England, in the UK, about this issue of design and environment. I'm sure some people in the audience might know it. It was a special issue about the Middle East. And on the cover, there was this camel, and I was so intrigued by the image. And looking in the back of the image, I recognized Beirut, which is a modern city. So this camel is actually in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, we don't have camels in Lebanon. So this is to say that there is this bias or this, I mean, Edward Said would call it like a colonial or a misunderstanding about what places outside the West are about. And this is, for me, was another trigger for researching with more depth what was this modernism about? Why is it in a crisis now? And will it recover in a certain way? So this is Beirut. Beirut is a modern city. It's mostly a 20th century city. I like this quote by Tafuri. He said, "Those who seem to negate history produce historically motivated work, and those who try not to cut their links with it run into the shoals of ambiguity." And this is important because more frequently than not, in Lebanon, local architecture is reduced to traditional architecture. In other words, if you want to call a house or any design a Lebanese one, then necessarily you have to refer to 19th century or even before. Whereas in the 20th century, we had a very productive and very experimental architecture that I will show tonight for those who are not familiar with it. And yet it did not filter to and through the minds of, I would say, the locals, because it is not recognized as an architecture of value. Not enough because we've seen a lot of demolitions, and we cannot say that the Lebanese preservation law gives any credit to this architecture so far, but there are some changes and we will speak about that. Another quote that I think is important to start with so that you understand my intellectual background and my intellectual position, which is that in countries like ours, we really need to understand modernism as a mindset, not as a style, of course. And it is very important for us, especially in times of crisis like the whole Arab world is going through these days, which is to incorporate modernism in our lives in order to construct personal and public lives that we will not have to be ashamed of. So for me, speaking about modernism is also a sort of a cause, and maybe we can discuss this later in the presentation or questions and answers. So Beirut is a modern city. In this poster that I called When Lebanon Was Modern, I tried already back in 2004 at the Docomomo conference to speak about the variety and richness of this architecture. But already at the time, we were just post the Lebanese war, and a lot of demolition was happening. Many buildings were endangered, many buildings were disfigured, and the cause started back then. This is the area we'll be talking about later in the presentation. But before we do that, I would like to take you through a quick presentation of modernism. We can say that the late 19th century witnessed already a change in Beirut, in Beiruti buildings, and started to appear this sort of archetype, which is what we like to call the Lebanese house, which is like a sort of central hall house that is already a mix of a lot of things, whether imported materials or the layout and so on. And this architecture is known to be representative, if you want, of the modern bourgeois mansion that the elite was able to build in the late 19th century, early 20th century. We're talking here mostly about the commercial elite. That actually, many of these people became rich because of the port, and we will speak about this at the end. So we could say basically that the port brought to Beirut its heyday, and today it might bring its demise, and hopefully not. These buildings are all over Beirut of the late 1890s. I want you to remember them later when we see the sort of pastiche that was built mostly after the Lebanese war of buildings of the sort. Some of you may know the Central District with these lined buildings with this sort of local version of the Art Deco with low motifs, with lined galleries and so on. And you have the model of the archetypical house being transformed gradually. I call this the Darwinian evolution of the species. So it is adapting to what's coming. We have here fancy buildings, I would say, using the same archetypical plan, but having its own variations depending on the site, on the position in the city and context. In this case, we see these models developing into something that is less decorated, but yet keeping with the same central hall plan. And you can see that with these bay windows, protruding out, or bays or volumes protruding out, you can get a side view to the street. So these are windows that allow you to see across the whole street. And if one looks at the architecture, or at Beirut in particular, because we're talking about that here, we can explain these evolutions by performance and not necessarily by style. Buildings of the 1930s, keeping more or less with the same central hall plan. There are plenty of these 1930s, 1940s buildings in Beirut, very, very rich. Streets, the model is changing a little bit. You have the shops on the ground floor, some garages. Sometimes the building is recessed, or at least part of it, which gives you the terrace of the first floor. Important buildings like this on a corner, we were able to stop the demolition of this building. Many buildings with float rendered plaster like these. So new materials, new finishings. Sophisticated detailing at terraces and so on. Climate protection, whether with the sunscreens or with these sort of shutters that unfortunately people are throwing away nowadays. Very efficient. Very interesting play with these balconies that of course are a ventilation device. So the hot air gets up and it is ventilated through these openings. So you have dozens and dozens of these variations on the theme of the radiator, if you want. Sophisticated lobbies and halls. Of course, people know these sort of postcards of the Corniche. This is Beirut in the 50s. This is a famous one, still there, quite disfigured, but still okay. Ventilated stairs and cursive. So in this building, for example, you arrive to the floors and walk outdoor in a covered pathway, and then enter the 3 small apartments that are there. And this is in continuity with what happened before in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. And I will show some buildings later of that period. So modernism was the motto. We're here in 1950 with the alumni clubhouse of AUB. Another project by the same team, Maqdisi and Adib, with a Polish architect, Karol Szajer, who came to Beirut in the 40s and remained until the 70s. And this is a very interesting case of collaboration. Many of the buildings we will see are the result of a very fruitful collaboration between local architects and foreign architects or engineers and so on. This has always been the case. This was built by Georges Reyes, who studied in the UK at the AA. Georges Reyes never graduated at the AA, but he came back to Beirut and had like an honorary degree. And this is a famous building that is unfortunately filed for demolition. We're trying to fight for its preservation for many, many reasons. Another building by the same architect, Georges Reyes, with this transparent entrance towards the garden, and the lobby is to the right, as you see in the photo. Public buildings like these tobacco regies, there are 7 or 8 factories across the country, and they were the result of competition. So this is a time of emulation, of competition, and this is one of them. Some were built by, here, for example, a French architect, and there are many that were built by local architects, Qasim Kanaan and others. Very sophisticated structure. Very thin shed. This is 8 centimeters at its thinnest in concrete with a very long span. Schools. Public buildings like the Central Bank by Adolphe Julliard in the 60s, a Swiss firm. Here, a local architect, Maurice Hendy, partnered with André Wojanski, is known to have been one of the main right hands of Le Corbusier. And this is a major building in Beirut, the Ministry of Defense, unfortunately partly disfigured today. but this was a very smart solution. The generals wanted a Lebanese so-called building. So they managed to offer these sort of galleries or covered walkways that didn't necessarily repeat the arches, yet provided this shade and this protection from the rain while officers and others walked from one building to the other. And there is a funny joke about this, which is that these openings that you see here, they suggest the arch. So they were asked, namely by the general who was in charge of negotiations, to design a Lebanese building. Lebanese means, you have these arches. So they managed to convince him that these T-shaped sunscreens would suggest arches if one wanted to see those. So this is, I think, a very interesting makeshift or a trick whereby they were able to pass this modern architecture. They were interested in having a protection device for the windows, not necessarily repeating anything or referring to anything that was there. At the same time, they had to manage and maneuver. Here you have a mosque, very interesting design by Asim Salam, who also tried to maneuver through the expected. And instead of having, for example, in the facade, having a row of arches, which would be representational, he rather built these arches in the sequence, walking around the space that is here, which is the outdoor praying space. Another trick is to use these sorts of beams, drop beams, to suggest the arabesque motif, which is not found anywhere else in the design. And the dome is obviously a very modern interpretation of the dome, very much inspired by Candela and other engineers and architects of the time or even before. And he's using local material like a sandstone, and the minaret is somewhere between the campanile and the minaret. So there is a lot of, I would say, humor here, but he was a serious architect, and he was trying to juggle with between his intentions as a modern architect and the local references and so on. So at that time, reference was not pastiche. There was a very subtle way of putting things together. Churches also have a very, very rich repertoire, if you want, of modern churches. This is by Jacques Ligebeller. And here you have a very difficult ceiling that is made of hyperboloid parabols. So of course you understand that the section changes every 10 centimeters. So you can imagine how difficult it was to, first of all, imagine this at the time, then do the formwork for it, find somebody, a local contractor who's capable of doing it, and ending up doing it. So we have, for example, in our archives, many sections on this ceiling, and they are really very, very smart, very smartly done. We also have international architects of renown like Alto and Roth with this Sabbagh building in Hamra, providing very interesting urban space at the corner of two main streets in Beirut. And we have the brutalist trend of the 60s and 70s, best represented here by Interdesign Showroom, which was started in 1975. What seems to be here a very brutal and violent, I would say, piece of architecture is a beautiful serenity inside with beautiful indirect light produced by these sorts of light catchers and voids and platforms that turn around the void. It's a really fascinating building. Then came the war. With the war, it was mostly a tabula rasa, much more than an actual reconstruction. And this we see here in this what we call the Beirut Central District. Some people call it Solidaire. Solidaire is the private company that took upon itself to develop the center. These are photos taken by Gabriele Basilico, a very famous photographer, of the center. This was the condition. But unfortunately, what was demolished by the company was much, much more than what was demolished because of the war. And I like to show this sort of brochure of the 1996 by Solidaire. And I use their own words if you want, or I hit at them with their own images. And in their brochure, you have three photos, very telling photos. On the upper part, you have people talking to each other. So they claim participation, but it's actually the board of Solidaire talking to itself. This is the actual board of Solidaire. So every two are pretending that they are discussing the city, but they're not discussing with anybody else but them. And then in the second, you have boys playing, okay? Boys play with the city. It's like a game, it's like a model, and so on. And the third, everybody is prosperous and happy. So they are promising us prosperity and happiness, all well-dressed and so on. History turned out differently, of course. And this image is already telling us what's going to happen, because this is a German researcher telling us that everything in blue was demolished after the war and not because of the war. So this is quite telling about this tabula rasa. That was a big mistake. And probably Mike was mentioning this when he said, let's try to see if we can avoid the mistake or the mistakes that we do when we rebuild cities. And obviously this was a big mistake. So demolitions everywhere. I call this in a lecture, the amnesic phoenix. We have this myth, I think it's an awful myth, about the phoenix that will rise anyway from the ashes. You know, we're very proud of it. I think it's our problem because it rises always with amnesia. So we don't remember anything. We start from scratch. This phoenix is always rising, but not necessarily for the benefit of the group. It rises for the benefit of the few. And we start to erase what we know about our city, especially when Photoshop is around, and when also this idea of the image making is more important than the building itself. So here, for example, you have a hotel advertisement, and I was so curious. I mean, I knew the neighborhood, and I was so surprised to see this in their publicity. So I know that I had a student who had a boat, so I asked him to take a photo from the sea, from the same angle, and he came back with this photo. And this is the actual city behind it, but there was a denial in this brochure. There was a denial. So you can pretend that you are in some sort of island, right? You don't suspect there is a city behind this. So we kept on denying our city. And this building that is in the back, in the middle, is the Hotel Carlton that we saw here being demolished. And many, many buildings were demolished. This one was in good condition, but was demolished. Hotel Saint-Georges is endangered. This is one of the first concrete exposed buildings of the 1930s. This is an Art Deco cinema demolished. This villa, very interesting transitional plan between the central hall and the modern plan, demolished. Many hotels and others in the center could have been kept. They were put down. This Cinema Rivoli as well. This very important building of the 30s with a 10-meter span in the basement for the Ford garage, and the courtyard with a restaurant in the middle, demolished. This center with the egg, you probably have seen some of the photos. We have the archives in our center. Was disfigured in many ways. This crafts showroom transformed. The Mishrif Country Club, I was looking for this building and I couldn't find it. And it turned out that it was dressed with the Lebanese garb. So imagine that building was dressed with this, and it became this. This is from the inside, and this is it from the outside. Complete denial of its nature. Sorry, there is a mix in the slide. So here we go back to the Maison de l'Artisan, which is the Lebanese crafts showroom. Slender columns glazed all around, exhibiting the local crafts. And it was dressed again with these, Renaissance balustrades, red tiled roofs, fake vaults on the inside, and so on. This building is threatened by demolition, transformations of major parts. This is not in Beirut. I tried to put mostly examples in Beirut, but this is Saida, and it is also unfortunate. And we have this pastiche of historical reference and pastiche of modernism, and I put them back to back, of course. And traditional architecture was expressed in, reference on the facades, like this project, the Saifi Village. And what is shameful, I would say, in this is that they didn't even follow the richness of the central hall plan. So what you see here with these triple arches, you can see it in the plan. The triple arches that are here give to a normal, like a bedroom, whereas the living room, or what could have been the public space of the house, is given two simple windows. Therefore, this idea of the connection between the plan and the facade was completely lost, no matter what style it was about. And we were told that this is our public space. So public space, in the public space, you have two policemen, a maid and a kid. And it is not really public, because if you're not from the neighborhood, you might feel awkward or unwelcome. And many of the public buildings, or mostly political buildings, like here, for example, the residence of the late Prime Minister Hariri in Koraitim was built like that. The presidential palace, that was a modern building of the 50s, 60s, during renovation was transformed again and dressed into a sort of Lebanese garb. All across the political spectrum, the Speaker of the House of Parliament built for himself this fake historical building. It was built in the 90s. And modern buildings of importance, like Hotel Phoenicia by Ferdinand Daguerre and Stone and Rodolphe Eliès, was again dressed with capitals and Doric columns and so on, arches in the back and so on. The Casino du Liban that was built by Albert Massa and Nicolas Bkhazi, local architects, it had a facade by Claude Parent, the French architect, and it was a very interesting play with like a skin that protected itself from the sun. It was broken and dressed with a vec or a tinted glass facade that looks heavier. It's strange what I'm saying, but sometimes glass looks heavier than concrete. And you have all these comparisons that I make between actual buildings of the 50s here to the left in Hamra, and pseudo references to historical architecture that never was. We never had this sort of mansard in our architecture, and this looks odd in Hamra, the building of the 2000s. So we decided to start this Arab Center for Architecture. So I moved to the second part of the lecture. We created this center that is a center. It is an NGO, the Association for the Preservation and Dissemination of Modern Arab-Built Heritage. We started it in 2008. So we are now in our 12th year. This is our logo. It is a letter A for Arab and architecture. It is also letter Ain for those who can read Arabic, which is Arabi, which is Arab, and Amara, which is architecture. Nice coincidence. And it has a sort of shelter. So the idea is to preserve architecture, whether buildings or the praxis of good architecture, or archives when only this is possible. The objectives are to build an archive, to initiate research outside academia, and this is important, we can discuss this later, to promote knowledge and to participate, if possible, it's very hard, in the protection of architecture and design heritage. We want to raise awareness about architecture. We want to develop the cultural value of architecture, recognize its social impact. We want it to be a platform to discuss the issues of the built environment, and now, for example, reconstruction and so on. So we gather documents, books. We have a good library open to everyone. We have archives, physical archives. We cannot buy archives, so we wait until somebody is convinced that it's better for their documents to be with us, because we protect them in every way possible. We organize the material, put it in our database, and so on. It is at the service of everyone. We try to do it in the proper way with acid-free paper, with cotton threads, and everything is. It takes us a lot of effort. We have interviews. It happens that I audio recorded many architects and engineers in the late 90s, and these became a treasure, because these are people that nobody asked anything for a long time. They were simply busy building, and they actually didn't think of their work as something that was extraordinary, but it is of high value, I can assure you. We also have a collection of beautiful drawings, original drawings. This is, for example, the Électricité du Liban headquarters. It was the competition drawing. We have the full file. These are variations on the theme of a house by Farid Trad. sketch or a perspective of a chalet by Seraf. Seraf is a Lebanese architect. He was born in Lebanon. This was the first house with a green roof. We have the drawings. We have the drawings of this house by Ragat. Ragat is a famous Austrian architect who made Beirut his home for some 25 years and taught. He's known as the author of a book on traditional architecture in Lebanon. We, as much as possible, go ourselves and bring archives when they are to be lost or thrown away and so on. These are, for example, the archives of Raoul Vernet. We're preparing a book about Raoul Vernet now. A colleague, Eli Harfouch, is doing it. So we've scanned everything. We are very happy to have the archives of Georges Reyes because with this series of schools that he designed in collaboration with Jafar Touqan in the Emirates, we were called by an institution in the Emirates, and they are refurbishing one of the schools. There were 8 of them. It's prototypical schools. 6 were demolished. There are 2 that are remaining. And we were very happy to contribute by merely sending them the original drawings so that they could restore one of the schools with the period details and according to the original drawings. These are some of the drawings. It's a very interesting project with like a mate and courtyards and malqaf, which is a ventilation device, very interesting one. We created with we are part of a collective of institutions and NGOs. We called it the Modern Heritage Observatory, Marsad al-Turath al-Hadith. We did some publications together that you can find online. We organized international conferences. We also like to support schools and teaching. This is a studio at LAU, and the professors came to our center to use our archives and produce models of modern buildings in Badaro, for example. We organized exhibitions. This was our first exhibition a few years back. We produced a set of postcards. We would like to present Beirut not only as a city of the 19th century, but a city of modernism as well, which is what it is about. We are part of the International Archives Day. Every year we have an open exhibition where we have kids and others come and look at drawings and artifacts, models. This was about furniture of the 50s with original drawings that we hold. This was about the entrances of buildings and art in architecture with the Beirut Design Week. This was about the skins of buildings and climate response. Public lectures, we do a lot of public lectures, book launchings. This is on Baghdad, and obviously our scope goes beyond Lebanon towards the Arab world. We're part of this sort of collective, as I mentioned. We organized a series of that we call Discover, Visit, and Debate. This is for kids. It's about discovering architecture. So it's a toolkit with lectures and so on. We have guided tours, very successful guided tours. This is one of them in Za'a al-Blat, outside Beirut also, Tripoli. This is Burj Hammoud in Beirut, Badaro, Furn al-Shabbak, Yerzeh and Hadet. This is the tobacco regie that we saw before. Marm Khail, which is one of the neighborhoods that were very much hit during the blast. We also support campaigns like here, the campaign to stop a highway that is supposed, this is a simulation done by Save Beirut Heritage. We support these younger institutions. We love it when they go on TV to insult a minister, but we like to give them the fuel for it, which is data and information, because we cannot do it ourselves, of course. Hopefully this project will be stopped. We can discuss it later. We were able to convince the Ministry of Culture to put modern buildings on the National Heritage Day. So we organized guided tours on that day to the Tripoli Fair, Rashid Karame Fair in Tripoli, designed by Oscar Niemeyer, a very, 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 I was going to say interesting, this is a common word, unique, really unique compound of buildings and landscape. Rayak, way outside of Beirut in the Bekaa. Corniche, Hamra. We also do guided tours of contemporary buildings and sometimes with the designers. So the designers take people there. This is a tour about brutalism in Beirut. This is outside the city by the architects. So whether it's Hala Younes or Bernard Khoury or Fadlo Dagher, Maroun, and many other architects. We organized this series of discussions between two generations of architects. Here is Burhan Tayyara, late Burhan Tayyara, an excellent Syrian architect who died a few months after his lecture at the Akka. And we were very happy to actually record it because now there is a documentary that will come out and they will use a lot of the material shot during that lecture. It was a very interesting debate between two generations. We also organized a very successful lecture series between a writer and an architect working on the same city. You have an architect and a writer on Beirut, two others on Tripoli, and two others on Cairo. We were very happy to design and with Bernard Khoury, the designer, but I was the co-curator of the Bahrain Pavilion at the Venice Biennale that some of you may know in 2014. It was very well received, so it's like a rotonda, and 40,000 copies of the book that I produced for the occasion were distributed freely. And this was one of the milestones because it disseminated suddenly modern Arab architecture, modern architecture in the Arab world. I don't like to call it Arab. It's modern architecture in the Arab world. And it was very well publicized and distributed. These are a few images of the book. We produced also with UNESCO this exhibition and catalog about modern architecture in the Arab world with posters about all the countries, one building per country, very difficult task to choose. This is National Library in Damascus. This is Al Hussein city in Jordan. We were very happy to support also the work of curator Hala Younes for the first Lebanese pavilion at the Architecture Biennale 2018, which was mostly about landscape, beautiful setting with a 3D model and projections on it. And the book that she produced for the occasion, excellent book, The Place That Remains. And we were able also to disseminate these ideas through a bank called the Banque Libano-Française with a blog. And it is very interesting because I was so surprised to see that some of the small texts that I wrote for this, describing a building, speaking about its qualities, it's like 10 lines. It was read by 40,000 people or 30,000 people. You would never dream of such a thing. So it was a good collaboration. And sometimes you have to get out of our own world and the audience. Then came the blast. So it brings me to the third part. Then came the awful blast. And obviously Beirut will never be the same after the blast, whether for the better or the worst. This was on 4 August, everybody knows it. These are the silos of Beirut. So it was very close to the silos and it demolished and hit a lot of buildings. Our offices, the Akka offices, are 1,500 meters away from this point, and we had most of our glass broken and so on. So you have to imagine how hard this was for everyone. And it was really a mess in the city. Lives taken, belongings, and futures of people were really completely blasted. So the silos, going back to architecture, the silos already were something at the time where they were built. They were built actually with a sliding formwork. So they were built and the pouring of concrete was not interrupted for many days until they reached the top. So the formwork was sliding on rails. It was sliding up until it hit the top for, of course, safety reasons with the concrete so that you don't get cracks and so on. And they actually survived many years until the blast came. This is a top view with the NASA showing the damage and how far it went. And we created a consortium with other people called the Built Beirut Heritage Rescue with the aim to assess the damage and try to help whenever it's possible. This is the part of the neighborhood that was hit. You have the Electricité du Liban to the right, and these mansions and the other buildings in the back. A lot of interest is going towards these mansions for good reasons. I mean, this is beautiful. Of course, everybody would agree, and it represents somehow the image of these neighborhoods. But what we're trying to do at the Arab Center for Architecture is to look at other buildings, maybe more mundane buildings, more what I call B-series buildings that make 80% of the city. And here you have some of them, for example, this one in the middle and many in the back or way further. While the Ministry of Culture, and we are very much in touch with the Directorate of Antiquities that is in charge of the heritage buildings, they created recently a very interesting idea, which is adopt a house. So people are asked to find the money to renovate one particular house. What we're trying to do is something else, which is to, first of all, to assess damage subjected to modern architecture. Use this to start an inventory because it is not there yet. And of course, this will require a lot of money. Second thing we're doing is we're now in the process of producing a manual of good practice in the restoration of modern architecture. And we like participation. In this image in the middle, we're talking to people and choosing with them the colors of the buildings, the colors of the rails, and so on. And we are also helping the UNHCR with some capacity building for their NGOs. There are many NGOs on the ground who are doing restoration work without any knowledge about it. So we do these lectures whereby we explain what are the specificities of the materials of the period, the details of the period, the naming of the plasters, and so on. Here, for example, how to renovate cracks, serious cracks in walls. Of course, how to try to save wood when it is possible. This is Kotrani wood. It's very expensive wood. Sometimes they remove it and put aluminum instead. What is the detail, proper detail to protect, I mean, to design a window and so on. And we take these NGOs on guided tours. So instead of doing guided tours for the pleasure only, we do it now for a very, very specific purpose, which is to explain what these neighborhoods are about, whether they're public space, their material, how people live in those buildings, what's special about them, why is it important to keep them, and so on. So we speak more about these mundane buildings, I would say. But this one is a very interesting one because of its blur between in and out, and it's it has 3 levels of entrances, and it is also made of, the windows are made of wood, very good craftsmanship. The details of the balconies are typical of the time when these were in concrete, but still using this corbel effect with the anchoring and so on. So we explain these issues to the people who are going to renovate so that they keep them as an open book to the construction of the city. And we also campaign for this idea of layering. It is okay if concrete is used like here. Paint will do it. Paint will manage to blur, if you want, the time between one part of the building.
I think we lost George for a minute. So if you're not familiar with Beirut, the electricity goes off every like 3 hours for 2 seconds. So he will be back in a bit. In the meantime, I invite you all to ask questions in the chat, and we will take these questions at the end when George is back.
Yeah, it's that's frustrating because he was just sort of reaching peak moment there, wasn't he? I mean, what I find interesting was the whole issue of the kind of beautification of modernist buildings, which he was showing us, which is particularly relevant at the moment when we've got a government white paper which talks about beauty and building better, building beautiful, etc. And what defines beauty, and it really is in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? And that this kind of veil of sort of Arabic styling that place over buildings is quite extraordinary, really.
Yes. So George will be back in 1 minute. So yeah, he's back.
His generator on.
Yes.
But the amazing amount of work he does with the Arab Center is extraordinary.
It was an electricity shortcut. This is typical of Beirut. So you get the sense and the taste of how we live, but it's fine. It's fine. Shall I go on? I still have 2 to 3 minutes.
Yeah, please carry on, George. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I was telling you about these layers of the city and how to accept modification, addition, and so on. This is what Beirut is about. Okay. Probably because we also don't have a very strict law of population. Probably because the mindset is that since we have Baalbek and very ancient things, it is okay if the city is built of layers and we demolish and add and so on. Sometimes things are more or less successful and sometimes much less successful. Here I show these stairs, for example.
Do you mind sharing your screen again, George?
Okay. 1 second. I'm sorry about that. Let me see. Yes. 1 second. There you go. I'm sorry about that again.
No problem. Perfect.
Okay. So it is okay. Layers are okay. The question of the stairs is typical. These outdoor stairs. So when we do these guided tours, we explain that these are important. They have to be kept. This is public space raised to levels, and this maybe you can remember what I showed before, a building of the 50s, and there are many of them that use this sort of interstitial space or private/public space. We also speak a lot about these additions also in volume. So building on top of buildings in ways that I think are rather okay, like this building to the left. And these interstitial spaces, public spaces, when we take these people, the NGOs around now, we tell them that they should take as much care about these interstitial spaces than they do about the individual units. Stairs, for example, like the Jemaise stair, or the fences and so on. And here I like to show this image of this lady standing on her balcony, because the new trend, for example, with this tower, this glazed tower, slick tower, is losing a lot of what the Beirut weather can offer with these outdoors and this social space that happens between balconies. We're unfortunately losing these as we speak. This I showed already. And I'm ending with this photo of Electricité du Liban that is on the poster. We hope to find the money to preserve it in its way. And of these last two photos that speak again of the layers, this is the PGA building in Mar Mkhail in the Jemaise area. It is abstract enough, modern enough, and it speaks to the locality without doing reference to anything around it. And I maybe end with this image of layering. It was a time when there was still a scale to the city, a human scale, domestic scale, that unfortunately we're losing nowadays. And this is our center. It's a very small place with a lot of ambition. And these are our contacts with the website, the Facebook page, and the email. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Well, George, that was a fantastic concise overview of a really complex and multi-layered city, which I think you kind of made very clear. As Ode says, if anybody's got questions, we will have time for a few at the end. Use the chat function on the screen. But I think that two clear things came out of this for me, or two clear themes. One is this notion of modernism in a city like Beirut. And the second is clearly the issue of the reconstruction. So, I mean, I just sort of pick up on those 2 points first. What I found interesting was your point, really, that is in a sort of post-colonial situation, how does a sort of modern architecture that is appropriate to Beirut develop? And in a way, it's the sort of critical regionalism argument of Kenneth Frampton. And do you feel that that did happen in Beirut or Lebanon after the sort of 60s?
Yes, certainly. This what Frampton and actually it was other people Tsonis and Lefebvre, who I think coined this idea of critical regionalism. Yes, you find it a lot in the Beirut of the 60s, with the work of Asim Salam, of Lige Belair, and even with the work of some modernists who thought that they were doing international architecture. For example, Wasik Adib, in one of my interviews, he said something I think fascinating. He said, "We thought we were international, we discovered we were local." So he thought he was producing what was being produced everywhere. And when somebody was telling him about the work, they said, I see that this is local. So which for me means that architecture was good. And when architecture is good, it points this or that. It is local, international, same time, because it is of its time, but it is also of its place. What unfortunately happened during, I mean, at the end of the war and mostly after the war, and it makes, I mean, in my dissertation, I explain it. What happened was a sort of course, nostalgia. Nostalgia is good and bad, actually. So this nostalgia made it that people were hasty on referencing things rather than learning the lesson of things. And I tried very quickly. I know it's very, it might be a messy presentation because I had to sort of cover several issues. But I think in some of the examples I chose, I made it clear that some of the references made sense, climatic response and so on. And then when came pastiche, it didn't make sense because it didn't even perform as good as the former architecture. And of course, you had, of course, the postmodern wave and so on, always 10, 15 years later than everywhere. And what happens usually in our part of the world is that trends last. So certain directions taken by architecture somewhere may pass and then you move to something else and so on, but they remain and last somewhere. What is unfortunate in the case of Beirut is that it lived really a sort of adopted, I called it in the dissertation, adopted modernism. In another chapter, I called it adapted modernism. And it was incorporated in the mindset. It was not, I mean, except for a few, extremes of superficial playfulness or whatever you want to call it, it was very rational, very local. It made a lot of sense. It made common sense. And for example, when you speak of today, of the sustainability and the sustainable design and so on, frankly, compare many of the buildings of the period with any design that today tries to get this checklist, BREEAM and LEED and what have you. Well, you find that they are high in competition without even mentioning it in the discourse. So they produce architecture.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, that Ministry of Defense building you showed us, I thought was really interesting because that developed its own. It's clearly a modernist building, but it developed something that felt kind of local and quite cleverly, as you pointed out, sort of reinterpreted the idea of the arch. Moving on, we've had a couple of questions, but just before we go on to those, just moving on to the post-blast. One of the issues that I think is really critical is what happens to the people that were displaced. Will they be is there a sort of a political move to make sure that they're not moved out and the area handed over to developers, or
okay, this is a very interesting question. Yes, there is an attempt from the government that is absent on the ground, of course, and our political mess. And most of the work is done by NGOs and volunteers and so on. However, I have to say that there was a freeze on transactions. So in order not to have what we call the vultures, when I was called by Le Monde because they had interviewed me a couple of years before on modern architecture, and they called me the day after the blast to say, well, what can you tell us now? It's hot, and what can you tell us? My title was "The Vultures Are Back," and they used it as a title. And every day we see that the vultures are back. I give you my personal story, you know, the glass of my car was broken, you know, the front and the back, because I was under the center. It's very far, but still big blast and so on. Awful nightmare on that evening. And the 2 days, I mean, the next day, there was on my car 2 cards. One from a guy trying to sell me glass for the car, and one trying to buy the car. To give you an idea of how we, you know, as Lebanese, we react. We are resourceful, we are entrepreneurs and so on. And we come and say, okay, what can I do out of this? And the same, of course, happens to developers and so on. And there were attempts, you know, at transactions, and they are happening also. Because when we say the transactions are frozen, it doesn't mean that you cannot go and buy a building, but you simply don't register it now. So you buy it under the table and you will register it in 2-3 years, whenever that's possible. So that's for one. On the other hand, you cannot blame people, because people, you know, the economic condition is so low that they would sell for any price when you give them fresh dollars. People who have, you know, middle income people cannot even take $100 from their account in the bank. So it is a big mess. And of course, some people are using it. However, the transactions are frozen in the area for, I think, a year or 2, I can't remember. And there is pressure now to sign the law. There is a law that has been prepared for preservation and so on. It is in the parliament. And the idea is to make, you know, an inventory, a serious list of classification and so on. It will not happen without a big battle, political battle, but to happen in a certain way. At the same time, what needs to be done is not only to think about the buildings themselves. You have to provide opportunities for people to remain where they are. Yeah. We speak about a neighborhood that has, you know, old craftsmen and young designers and everything in between. And of course, the nightlife and so on. And you have people who have been living in heritage buildings, but don't have the means to fix one window. We should not think that because they live in heritage buildings that they are wealthy and so on. Yeah. And you have all sorts of entanglements of rights between owners of buildings and tenants, and the Lebanese law has never been fair to any of the two. So it is a big mess. And what the blast did is provide us with this nudity that forces us to see what we are and our real problems. Everything came to the surface with that blast, whether heritage issues or even you know, social relationships between neighbors and so on. And it brought up everything good in us, and at the same time everything bad.
Well, I'll ask. We've got a couple of questions here. John Walker's asked. We have conservation areas and listed buildings in the UK. Is there a similar system in Beirut to protect heritage?
There is nothing about areas, and you will be surprised to know that the number of listed buildings is under 100 in the country. So although we really have a very rich heritage, starting from the 19th century, if I want to speak about urban areas, not about, of course, older things everywhere in the country, something has to be done about it. So for example, at the center, we applied for a grant with the World Monument Fund. We're still waiting for the answer to do a roadmap for the inventory. Because what happens now, it happens that I am in the Heritage Committee at the Ministry of Culture, and we meet every week or every 2 weeks, and we receive files, propositions of demolitions of building. So we have to go and look at the building, and more often than not, most of the time, we refuse demolition. Okay, but then what does it mean? You refuse it for what reason? If you refuse to demolish, if you refuse, I mean, we don't decide ourselves. We just do a report, and then the minister decides. Of course, we have to be clear about it. Yet, this means that if you take this decision, you are aware at the same time that you're forbidding somebody to do anything with something that they may not even be able to preserve in a certain way. So what you need to do is then to classify the building. So you need to, of course, justify what you're doing. So it's on a piecemeal work. This is not how it should be done. What we want to do, and the Ministry of Culture is totally aware of this, the Directorate of Antiquities, is to start this huge undertaking, which is to decide what is heritage, what are the criteria on which to decide if a building has to remain or not, and more importantly, a cluster of buildings or a neighborhood, whereby a building that seems to be banal but part of a group that makes sense in a certain way. Again, I spoke of an open book of the city and so on. Then you preserve the area and you put conditions on. It does not exist. In our zoning, we only have numbers of square meters that you can build and setbacks and heights. And this is what it's about. There's nothing that is specific to neighborhoods that have character or whatever.
Yeah.
And people make fun of these panels that say quartier à caractère traditionnel. You know, it's a heritage neighborhood. And people type on them, write on them, was a heritage neighborhood.
But do you think that because, sorry, Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, go on, Ode, please.
Do you think that because after the blast, some buildings that are not necessarily of value might be up to preserve because of the emotional also attachment of the people to this neighborhood? Because I know that there's a lot of buildings that are not necessarily of the modernist period or don't have any architectural value, but have a value of the space it's creating on the urban scale.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There is a change in mindset, obviously. I think social media has to do with it. I think the errors done with the city center have to do with it. People are more aware of the importance, even of the mundane, you know, because often you can, if you start to put criteria and say, well, is this building unique? No, it's not unique. Does it have anything very, very special? No, not really, and so on. So then let's demolish it. But when you think in other terms, which does it mean anything to the neighborhood? Does it mean anything to the people? Can it survive normally and naturally? So why demolish it? And between that time and now, people are more aware of sustainability issues, of the economic condition. I mean, if it will cost a lot of money. A lot of money means gentrification. Is already the people live where they work. They have a problem because we're building towers for people who don't live in the country, and people who need to work in the city live outside the city. No serious public transportation system, so they have to come with their cars. So traffic pollution and so on. I think there is something systemic. There is a problem in the way we approach our cities, and with this sort of revolution or change of people are asking for a change, and it's not only political, it's a change of how we approach things, and Beirut deserves it.
I think that's interesting. I mean, you've actually answered, I think, in that one of the questions from my Abu Salih, who asks about, you talk about layering of different architectural styles from different periods as a natural process in the evolution of the city. And how does this layering coexist with the idea of preservation? I think that's kind of what you've been talking about. And I mean, I'm really with you. I think the idea of sort of ordinariness being as important as, you know, specialness is what cities are made of. And there's a great danger of just erasing the basic fabric of the city to preserve the sort of spectacular fabric. I think we're sort of at run over, but I've got two more questions. A point from Keith Williams, which I think is really a statement, which is a fascinating expose of the power and beauty of critical regionalism in architecture. Thank you so much, Dr. Arbid. I wonder why, through war and disaster, war and disaster so often create a portal through which unchecked wholesale demolition seems to walk. I've never understood why. And I guess, you know, that's something for us all to ponder, and I think a really good one to end on. And I think, you know, certainly as a club, I'd be really interested to continue this conversation and you know, and work with you in some ways if we can, if any of us can. And one day maybe we can all come to Beirut and have, you know, enjoy your tours. But John Assail has asked asked you, really, so interesting. I'm saddened to see the extent of the damage caused by the explosion. Dr. Arbid, how can I engage with the adopter building to support the repair of these old houses?
Well, they can write to us an email info@arab-architecture.org. It is on our website, and we can put them in touch with the Ministry of Culture. They are handling this program. They have it's very interesting. It's like a wedding list. So you have a series of photos and the cost of restoration of each. It's an approximate cost, and you can repair a house or a building starting from, I think, $20,000 up to $500,000 or whatever. Right. You can also do an alliance, and I really use this this platform to thank you, because your firm helped the ACA with the sum. And what I think is happening is that a lot of people through social media, through you know, the Lebanese diaspora, they are everywhere, and with their connections, they manage to gather a significant amount. And some of it, even a little sum, you know, can you know, repair the glass and windows of people who really cannot do it nowadays. So it is helping a lot. Now, what needs to be done, of course, is only the individual. You know, to use this and answering the person who asked about war and why these things happen afterwards, and it is I think an opportunity. It's a sad and a sinister opportunity to rethink our master plan and think more in terms of neighborhoods rather than zoning, and to have dedicated zones, especially that now, I mean, it is a secret to none that the port might not take again its glory. What happened more or less in the same week as the blast is this peace treaty between the Emirates and Israel. And the port of Haifa will bring goods to the Gulf. So it's not going to be the port of Beirut. Beirut lived by the port, from the port, due to the port. And if it is not going to live from the port anymore, it has to live from something else. And that something else could also be its heritage. Yeah. So what seems to be a burden can become an opportunity if we know how to do it, and if we know how to take it, and if we keep people in place. Nobody will care about the heritage of a neighborhood more and better than the people who live there, whether they are experts in the field or not.
Well, I think on that note, we'll end. But I just again, Dr. Arbid, that was a fantastic presentation. I found it really illuminating and very sad at the same time. But you know, there's an enormous resilience in the Lebanese people, and I'm amazed at how they've responded already. And you know, let's look forward to continuing this conversation.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.